I'll just share my screen. Well, for the next 20 minutes, I'm going to reflect a bit on projects and reactions and interventions in urban environments in the Middle East, thinking about the idea of preserving the spirit of the place, and in some cases, not preserving the spirit of the place. And I hope that this reflection will give the audience something to think about, different ways of intervening and different ways of understanding the spirit of places in which we choose to work. I'm going to start with Cairo, a city in which I'm actually sitting in at the moment and which I know very well, where there have been many interventions over the past decades to revive and preserve the medieval and post-medieval quarters of the city, known as historic Cairo. This is an image of one of the main streets, El Mu'izz Street, after a large government scheme in the 2000s to preserve its monuments, improve the public infrastructure, and make it a more important visitor destination, especially for local residents of Cairo. One of the things to bear in mind is Egypt has, it's very important as a tourist destination, but that doesn't necessarily mean that historically Egyptians have also been and spent time in historic areas. They have tended to be outsiders. So the government scheme, coupled with a slight decline in tourism after the Arab Spring 10 years ago, COVID and many other limitations, have meant that actually there have been more Egyptians involved or spending time in the historic city. The government's plans are actually accelerating at the moment, and it has this idea that it can use the historic city can be a focal point of cultural life in Cairo, and it's investing huge sums of money, more than it's ever invested before, into what it calls an upgrading and development scheme, which is more ambitious, I would say, than even the scheme that you see in front of you, but is also taking place at a rapid pace. And the rapid pace is something I think that is hard in the context of a very complex city with many different realities of tourists and residents and workshops and declining infrastructure. And initially, with this expansion to the revival of historic Cairo, the government planned that it would build rebuild empty plots of land and house people living in shacks and in dilapidated conditions in these newly built buildings. But then it found that actually the cost of building the properties was much higher than it thought, due to underground water, leading to very expensive construction techniques. And in some cases, some residents, a small number of residents, will have to be relocated outside the historic city. And I happened to be at a meeting or an encounter between a government representative and somebody who makes tea in the historic city, who unfortunately has to move. And he was saying that to him, I mean, this neighborhood in which he lives and has always lived, the people, not just the buildings, but the people are what make the spirit of a place. And so he was saying, actually, I'd rather die than have to move somewhere else, because this is my neighborhood and it's part of my life. At which point, the person in charge of the development plan said, yeah, I fully sympathize with you. We tried as hard as we could to make sure that everyone could be accommodated in our redevelopment plans of the historic city. But unfortunately, in some cases, even though we have a very good will and very good commitment, some people feel worse off as a result of these schemes. And that in reality, often urban revitalization schemes have some people who feel worse off. But the point I'd like to make is, in thinking of the spirit of a place as architects or urbanists, one thing to bear in mind is that it's not just the buildings and the streets, but it's also the people and the activities and the life and That's what makes places what they are. So this is the building where the man has his tea stall. It's an 18th century building listed as a monument. And this is the main facade. But if you look at the aerial view, you'll find that what has happened over time is that what was once an open courtyard has had many, many encroachments, very badly built shacks. And I mean, basically people on limited incomes have moved in into the courtyard of this historic building. So you can see why in the process of trying to revive the city and preserve its monuments and bring them back to life, sometimes the intervention needs to involve relocating people. These are the kinds of buildings that the government is currently building to accommodate people whose houses have been demolished or destroyed. And from a physical point of view, it's hard to argue that they're bad places. They're often much better condition, much more spacious than the places in which people have lived in especially the poorer residents of a historic city. There is also an attempt, as you see, to capture something of a historic spirit of architecture. But I think for the people living in the historic city, what's very important to them is also not just a good physical environment, but also the community, the neighborhood, and the sense of familiarity of the places that they know. And so I've spoken to some people who have said, yeah, we think it's great that the government is building these things, but the most important thing for us is that we can come back and live where we've always lived. And one of the hard things I think about complex urban revitalization schemes is that there are many different opinions, different points of view, different priorities. And I remember when I worked on a project 15 years ago in historic Cairo for the Aga Khan Trust for Culture, we were aiming to, we did in fact, revitalize and restore a neighborhood square called Aslam Square. And we did it in a participatory way, bringing all the different uses of the square together. But actually, one of the things I found is that if you talk to people individually, sometimes they thought only of their own priorities and not necessarily of the interests of the people with which they share the common space. And the process of bringing people together and discussing is also a process of getting people sometimes to compromise and to think, well, how do I think of other people's interests as well as my own? And it is a time-consuming process. In the example I gave you before of the government consultant, actually, one of the things I found heartwarming is that because he was honest and he had integrity in how he dealt with the man who was very upset that he was going to have to move, the meeting ended well, that even though the man felt that he was at a disadvantage, he still felt, well, this guy respects me and he's honest and he gave me advice about where to choose a place to live and things in that regard. Often in interventions in historic cities like Cairo, many of the interventions focus on seemingly undesirable, perhaps undesirable things. This is a photo of the tanneries of Cairo, which have just been moved by the government. I don't know if any of you have experienced tanneries where they make leather. The smell is one of the most repulsive smells you could ever smell. And it's hard in a way to argue for their preservation in a city that has expanded. Traditionally, they were on the outskirts, and as the city expanded, they were always moved. So in this case, they've been moved to a new purpose-built facility. They were on what were once outskirts of the city. What you see in the middle of this image is the city aqueduct, built in the 14th and 15th centuries, and the tanneries were outside the aqueduct. The government, as parts of its program to develop the city, has moved the tanneries elsewhere. But actually, one of the things that large-scale urban developments and interventions sometimes overlook is where does an undesirable activity end, and where do desirable and nice areas, nice is a subjective word, but where do places where people enjoy being begin? And sometimes these places overlap. So this area, which I'm showing you, is very close to the tanneries. You can see the aqueduct in the background. And you can see just from this image that there's a sense of community. People are sitting outside chatting. There are old houses in poor condition, but I'm fearful that this bit of the neighborhood, which is the extension of the Tanneries district, will get demolished as part of the urban development scheme. And I think, as I said, time, I mean, if you don't have the luxury of time, and I told you the government is working fast, you don't always have the ability to go down and look building by building, street by street, and think, well, what do we really need to preserve, and what is justifiable to be removed? And I think that in Middle Eastern cities like Cairo, often the good and the bad are sometimes replaced inadvertently together. So this is just to show you examples of some of the architecture. You can see that it's not a slum. It's not even in terrible condition. It's quite a pleasant, low middle class area of the city. But I would say that the culture of places like Egypt is that new things are valued more than old things, and new buildings like the one that I showed you tend to be seen as better than late 19th century buildings that are slightly dilapidated. Here is one example, for example, of an attractive house of a relatively affluent family that just happens to be beside the aqueduct and beside the tanneries. And they're very worried that this house will also get wiped away. Look at the view. But as I told you, the problem is with large scale plans is that to be efficient, they don't waste time, they don't spend time. And it means that the details, the fine grain of what makes a city, sometimes it's seen as black and white rather than the careful intervention of smaller scale projects with more time and a bigger staff. This is the inside of the house, just to show you that actually it isn't poor, it's an affluent family that happens to be living in this historic and mainly slightly dilapidated area. And this is the kind of building that might replace what I just showed you. The other thing is, even in areas of the historic city where the government's plan is to build on heritage, sometimes they see the condition of buildings as being beyond repair. So look at this image of a historic area called Darb al-Labbana, and look at what's become of it in the process of government intervention to build on its history and its heritage. And for people who believe in that the historic fabric is also important, that it's important to retain old buildings and old doors and windows, not just to have something that looks old or looks in the spirit of the past, you realize that the rush to deliver this project is sometimes at the expense of preserving buildings like the one on the left, or the ones on the left, which a careful conservation architect would definitely have retained. So the other question is, apart from the people, is the spirit of the place only in what buildings look like, or is it also in the fact that they have a history that you see in them, the passage of time, the wear and tear? I would say that it is, but it isn't always, it isn't a shared view. Sometimes people think, well, as long as we return the area to look vaguely like what it was before, are we, so what? And this is the result of wide-scale demolition to reconstruct buildings that look like the old ones that were demolished. And this is a visualization of what it might be like. We also have another challenge in Egypt, that in some cases, there's the aspiration to be like the cities of the Gulf with high skyscrapers and tall towers, and not understanding that, or perhaps not fully understanding that cities like Cairo have their own history, their own heritage, and that we should perhaps spend more, invest in what exists rather than trying to be a different place. This is the process of building the things I showed you. I'm now going to move to another city, Gaza in Palestine. And if you look at Gaza on the internet, the first images that pop up are destruction and bombs and terrorism. And the Barakat Trust, for whom I work, actually funded a project there to intervene on trying to improve a historic building from the 14th century, which is currently the gold market. As you can see, it's vibrant, but it's also neglected and has wires and kind of infrastructure all over it. And the person that approached us from a university in Gaza said, actually, one of the things that people sometimes forget, even in Gaza, in Palestine itself, is that we have a history and we have a heritage, and it's hard sometimes to forget that that the political situation, which is so volatile and difficult, wasn't always the way it is. And with a small grant that we gave them, they managed to get funding from the EU to restore the building and do all of the phases of conservation. And it's still a thriving gold market. But one of the things that Munir was telling me, that during the process, the merchants in the gold market were saying, well, actually, this work is very disruptive. We have to close our shop for weeks, or we have to close for various periods of time. And what are we really going to benefit? And ultimately, when they did restore the building and the team convinced them that, or they worked around their schedules and tried to make it as smooth as possible, the gold merchants came back and said, actually, yeah, we really like what you did. People are coming because now the building is attractive, and people come just to look at the building, and it means that we have more footfall and we have better business. But sometimes, I think sometimes if you tell people we're going to change something, you'll get many objections, and people will say, oh, well, why do you want to change it? We like it the way it is. They sometimes can't remember what it was like before and can't imagine how change will be different. And I think the balance in urban intervention is about how do you preserve what is worth preserving, and how do you realize what you can change without compromising the spirit, the identity, the life of a historic urban environment. I thought I'd just show you an example of something closer to home. This Nasr Tower near Almeria in Spain, restored by two Spanish architects, Luis Castillo and Mercedes Miras. And in this case, it was a watchtower. It was dilapidated, and they said that the village, or the people living in the small town next to it, said, we used to kind of escape as children and climb up the ruins of the tower and have fun and have adventures. And so they tried, sometimes places, to capture the spirit of the place, what you need to do is actually minimal intervention and appreciate that the wildness, the ruggedness, the roughness, the solitude is part of what can make a place. It isn't always about life and activity and thousands of people. And I think this is a very good example. And as you see, they intervened with modern interventions to put this staircase to actually access the tower, but they tried to retain the spirit of an austere, defensive, simple structure. One of the things that's happening extensively in the Middle East is an increase in the understanding that heritage can bring tourists and revive the local economy or boost the local economy. This is Al Ula in Saudi Arabia, which for many decades was inaccessible. Actually, tourism was very limited in Saudi Arabia. And under the new government, there's a much greater understanding of, oh, well, we have all these wonderful sites, let's do something with them. Al Ula is an ancient site, it's magnificent. Here is the town. And one of the things that's happening is that there's a lot of intervention into making it a tourist destination. Very big architects like Jean Nouvel and others are designing very beautiful, sensitive buildings. And the old buildings of the town have been restored. But one of the questions is, of course, how can you really preserve the spirit of a place if you're changing the people that interact with it? This is a small town. It was very inaccessible. Now it's going to become accessible. There are art installations, very beautiful events, very well curated. But the balance of preserving tranquility and serenity and the small townness of a place like Al Ula, and the attraction of making it an important tourist destination and bringing people into the country. Sometimes it's a hard balance to strike, especially when economic opportunities are on the horizon. I think that often with existing places, if governments feel, oh well, actually we can have an economic boom because of these assets, cultural assets that we have, it's very difficult to stop them from investing and encouraging development. And it's very hard to limit the development so that it doesn't really change a place. This is, I mean, I went to one of these desert installations and it was actually fantastic, but there's always this sensitivity, I suppose, towards quiet, remote places that suddenly become popular by outsiders. I'm conscious that I'm probably running out of time, so I'll just give one simple example of a place that I think preserved the balance of local communities and heritage well. This is Muharraq in Bahrain, a recent winner of the Aga Khan Award for Architecture. Muharraq was the center of the pearl industry, which collapsed in the Gulf after the creation of the cultured pearl in the 30s. Many of its residents moved out and it declined in economic importance. It became a place for often migrant workers living in Bahrain. The government embarked on a very long and careful and slow and thoughtful process to intervene without trying to gentrify too much, thinking also about what do people of limited incomes need in a historic city like Muharraq. They realized that there were many sites, building sites, former building sites which were just ruins or vacant plots. They created small public spaces where people can reflect, they can meet their friends, they can sit at the end of a long day. And they also introduced cultural activities into some of the vacant buildings, but in a slow and thoughtful and incremental way, which I think is very different from the example I showed you at the beginning of Cairo, where the government is in a rush. It wants to deliver many things quickly. This project has been going on for decades. And I think that that's one of its successes, that it realizes that long-term change and thoughtful change is best achieved gradually and carefully. And this is another example of one of those squares. So, I mean, they combined modern design interventions within a historic city, I believe, quite effectively. Yeah, so what does it take to really understand the spirit of a place? This is Durham in the north of England, where I used to live. I remember noticing that all of the people from the Mediterranean and the Arab world congregated in one of the two coffee shops on this bridge leading into the city, on the one on the left. They never went to the one on the right. So I asked, well, why do you always prefer this one? And they said, oh, well, in this one, you can move the tables and the chairs easily. So we don't like to plan. We sit by this bridge. Our friends come by and they join us, and it's very casual, and that's what we like about it. And so sometimes, I think most of the time, really appreciating and understanding what makes a place is the best way, or perhaps the only way, to protect it and to preserve it. I chose this image, a Roman wall painting of household gods, the Lares and Penates, which I know through Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities. There's a very nice story about that there are different types of household gods believed to have inhabited places. One group of them is linked to a place, and the other group is linked to a family. And so some of them move around as the family moves from place to place, and others stay in the same place. And that they often have discussions and arguments about whose point of view is right. I think that actually places are as much about the static as about what changes. And it's only in being aware of the fact that some things remain the same and should remain the same, and others will always change, that one can put together effective and successful interventions. Thank you.